The morning sun was just starting to peek over the manicured hedges of Meadow Creek when the first letter arrived. It was tucked neatly into our mailbox, a crisp white envelope that looked innocent enough. But inside was a notice that would change our lives forever. My name is Mark, and I have lived here with my wife Sarah for 3 years. We chose this neighborhood because it was quiet and safe. Or so we thought. The letter was from the HOA board, signed by a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was the kind of man who measured the height of your grass with a ruler and took photos of your trash cans if they were left out 5 minutes past noon. The notice claimed our front door was the wrong shade of eggshell white. It demanded we repaint it within 48 hours or face a mounting daily fine. I showed the letter to Sarah while she was getting ready for work. She looked at it and sighed. Sarah is a busy woman. As the county sheriff, she deals with real problems like crime and public safety. To her, a dispute over door paint was a ridiculous waste of time. She told me to ignore it for now and said she would handle it over the weekend. But Arthur Vance was not a man who liked to be ignored. By Tuesday, a second notice appeared. This one was taped to our front door for all the neighbors to see. It was aggressive and threatening. It claimed we were in violation of Article 12 of the community bylaws and that legal action was being considered. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I have always been a law-abiding citizen, and the thought of being in trouble with the neighborhood board felt like a dark cloud hanging over our home. Sarah was out on a late shift, so I decided to walk over to Arthur's house to talk things out. I thought if I could just explain that we were busy and would get to it soon, he might understand. I was wrong. When I knocked on his door, he didn't even invite me in. He stood on his porch, looking down his nose at me through his gold-rimmed spectacles. He told me that rules were rules and that Meadow Creek had standards to maintain. He said that if people like us were allowed to let things slide, the whole neighborhood would fall into ruin. I tried to stay calm, but his arrogance was infuriating. I told him we would get to the painting when we could. He just smirked and said that time was running out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched the shadows of the trees dance on the bedroom wall. Sarah came home late, looking exhausted. I didn't want to bother her with Arthur's nonsense, but I could feel the tension building. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a camera shutter. I looked out the window and saw Arthur standing on our sidewalk, taking photos of our house. He was documenting everything. It felt like an invasion of privacy. I went outside to confront him, but he just turned and walked away without a word. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. We received fines for our mailbox being slightly crooked and for a single weed growing in the driveway. It was clear that Arthur had a vendetta against us. He wanted to assert his power and show us who was boss. What he didn't realize was that he was playing a very dangerous game. He saw me as a weak target and Sarah as just another housewife. He had no idea that behind that eggshell white door lived the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. The pressure continued to mount until it reached a breaking point. I found a group of neighbors whispering near the mailboxes. They told me that Arthur had been bragging about how he was going to run us out of the neighborhood. He was using the HOA as his personal weapon. I went home and told Sarah everything. Her eyes hardened. She had spent her career dealing with bullies, and she wasn't about to let one ruin our home. She told me to stay calm and let her handle the next move. But before she could do anything, Arthur took it a step too far. He called an emergency board meeting specifically to discuss our property. He invited the entire street, hoping to shame us publicly. We showed up, and the room was thick with tension. Arthur stood at the podium, presenting his photos like they were evidence in a murder trial. He called us a blight on the community. Sarah stood up, her voice calm and steady. She didn't mention her job. She just asked for common sense and neighborly respect. Arthur laughed in her face. He told her that her opinion didn't matter and that the law of the HOA was the only law that counted here. That was his first mistake. The meeting ended with a final ultimatum. We had 24 hours to comply with every single demand or they would take further action. As we walked back to our car, I could see the wheels turning in Sarah's head. She wasn't angry anymore. She was focused. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. And Arthur Vance was about to find out that some people are not meant to be pushed. The following morning began with an eerie silence. Sarah had left for the station early, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to focus on my work, but every little sound made me jump. Around 10 in the morning, the silence was shattered. A loud, heavy pounding echoed through the hallway. It wasn't a neighborly knock. It was the sound of authority. I looked through the peephole, and my heart dropped. There were 2 police officers standing on my porch. Behind them, standing on the sidewalk with a smug grin on his face, was Arthur Vance. He was holding a clipboard and looking at his watch as if he were timing the execution of a plan. I opened the door slowly. The officers didn't wait for me to speak. They asked if I was the owner of the property. Before I could answer, Arthur stepped forward. He told the officers that I had been trespassing on common areas and that I had threatened him during our last encounter.
It was a complete lie.
He claimed he felt unsafe in his own neighborhood and wanted me removed or cited for disorderly conduct. The officers looked skeptical, but they had to follow up on the call. They asked me to step outside. I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me as I saw a few neighbors peeking through their curtains. This was exactly what Arthur wanted. He wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. He wanted to show that he could summon the power of the law to crush anyone who stood in his way. I tried to explain that I hadn't threatened anyone, but Arthur kept interrupting, citing HOA bylaws and claiming that the police were required to enforce the peace of the community. One of the officers, a younger man named Miller, looked at Arthur and told him to pipe down. But Arthur wouldn't stop. He started shouting about his rights and how his taxes paid their salaries. He was making a scene, drawing more attention to our house. The situation was spiraling out of control. Just as Officer Miller was reaching for his handcuffs to settle the situation, a black SUV pulled into our driveway. The engine growled as it came to a halt. The door swung open, and Sarah stepped out. She wasn't in her casual clothes anymore. She was in full uniform. The gold star on her chest caught the sunlight, glinting with a sharp, cold light. The 2 officers on my porch froze. Their postures immediately shifted from aggressive to respectful. They knew exactly who she was. Sarah didn't say a word at first. She just walked up the driveway with a slow, deliberate pace. Every step seemed to vibrate with authority. She looked at the officers, then at the clipboard in Arthur's hand, and finally at Arthur himself. The smug grin on Arthur's face vanished instantly. He turned a pale shade of gray. He tried to speak, but only a small squeak came out. Sarah looked at Officer Miller and asked what was going on. Miller stammered, explaining that they had received a call about a domestic disturbance and threats. Sarah turned her gaze to Arthur. She asked him if he was the one who made the call. Arthur tried to regain his composure. He stammered that he was just doing his duty as the HOA president. He said that I had been difficult and that the rules had to be followed. Sarah took a step closer to him. She was much shorter than Arthur, but in that moment, she looked like a giant. She told him that filing a false police report was a serious crime. She asked the officers if they had seen any evidence of a threat or a disturbance. They both shook their heads. They looked embarrassed to be there. Sarah then looked at Arthur's clipboard. She snatched it out of his hand and began flipping through the pages. She saw the photos he had taken, the logs of our movements, and the list of petty fines. She told him that this wasn't neighborhood management. This was stalking and harassment. Arthur tried to argue, but Sarah cut him off. She told the officers that she would take over the scene. She told them they were free to go and thanked them for their service. As they hurried back to their patrol car, Arthur realized he was now alone with the very person he had been trying to intimidate. He started to back away, but Sarah told him to stay right where he was. She told him that she had been watching his behavior for weeks. She told him that the HOA does not have the power to override the rights of citizens or to use the police as a personal goon squad. She told him that she was going to conduct a full investigation into the HOA's finances and his personal conduct as president. Arthur's hands were shaking. He tried to apologize, saying it was all a misunderstanding. But the time for apologies had passed. Sarah told him to go home and stay there. She told him that if he stepped foot on our property again, she would personally book him for trespassing. As Arthur scurried away, his tail between his legs, the neighborhood was silent once more. But it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a bully who had finally met his match. Sarah turned to me and gave me a small, tired smile. She told me to go back inside and have a cup of coffee. She said the real work was just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah didn't just scare Arthur away. She went on the offensive. She knew that men like Arthur usually had secrets, especially when they had been in power for too long. She spent her evenings at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of paper and her laptop. She was digging into the history of the Meadow Creek HOA, which she found was shocking. It turned out that Arthur had been the president for over 10 years, and during that time, he had slowly gathered total control over the board. He had appointed his friends to key positions and pushed out anyone who disagreed with him. But that was just the beginning. Sarah discovered that the HOA's reserve fund, which was supposed to be used for emergency repairs and maintenance, was nearly empty. Thousands of dollars were missing. She tracked the payments and found a series of suspicious contracts awarded to a landscaping company owned by Arthur's brother-in-law. The prices were double the market rate, and half the work was never actually done. It was a classic embezzlement scheme hidden behind the veil of neighborhood rules. While Sarah worked on the legal side, I started talking to the neighbors. Now that the fear of Arthur was beginning to lift, people were finally willing to speak out. I heard stories of elderly widows being bullied into selling their homes and young families being buried under unfair fines. Arthur had been running the neighborhood like a small-time dictator, and everyone had been too afraid to stand up to him alone. But now that they knew the sheriff was on their side, the tide was turning. We organized a secret meeting at a local community center, away from the prying eyes of Arthur's supporters. Over 50 residents showed up. They brought their own records of harassment and suspicious fines. The energy in the room was electric. People were angry, but more importantly, they were hopeful. Sarah addressed the crowd. She didn't speak as a neighbor, but as an officer of the law. She explained what she had found in the records and told them that they had the power to take their neighborhood back. She helped them understand the legal process for removing a board president and how to call for a full forensic audit of the HOA books. Meanwhile, Arthur was starting to crack. He knew Sarah was onto him. He tried one last desperate move. He sent a group of his remaining cronies to our house in the middle of the night. They spray-painted insults on our driveway and threw eggs at our windows. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation. I wanted to go out there and stop them, but Sarah held me back. She told me to let them do it. She had already installed high-definition security cameras. We watched the live feed as they vandalized our property. Sarah just smiled and picked up her phone. She didn't call the local patrol. She called the duty sergeant at the station. Within minutes, 3 squad cars moved into the neighborhood with their lights off. They caught Arthur's friends red-handed. Among them was the HOA vice president and the treasurer. They were arrested on the spot for vandalism and conspiracy. This was the final blow to Arthur's regime. With his inner circle in jail, he was completely exposed. The news of the arrests spread through Meadow Creek like wildfire. The next morning, Sarah served Arthur with a formal search warrant for all HOA records and his personal financial documents. When she knocked on his door this time, she wasn't alone. She had a team of investigators with her. Arthur looked like a broken man. He didn't even try to fight it. He just sat on his sofa as they boxed up his life. The investigation revealed even more than Sarah had suspected. Arthur hadn't just been stealing from the HOA. He had been using the association's legal fund to pay for his own personal lawsuits. He was facing decades of prison time for fraud, embezzlement, and official misconduct. The neighborhood began to change almost immediately. The tension that had hung over the streets for years started to evaporate. People began to talk to each other again. They stopped worrying about the height of their grass and started caring about their community. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of the final board meeting, where the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see. Sarah wanted to make sure that the justice was not just done, but seen to be done. She wanted to ensure that no one like Arthur Vance would ever be able to rise to power in Meadow Creek again. The night of the final board meeting was the largest gathering in the history of Meadow Creek. The local school gymnasium was packed to capacity. In the front row sat the remaining board members, looking terrified. At the center of the stage was an empty chair where Arthur Vance used to sit. He was currently in the county jail, awaiting his first court appearance. Sarah stood at the podium. She wasn't wearing her uniform tonight. She was dressed in a simple suit, but the authority she projected was even more powerful than before. She began by presenting a clear and concise summary of the investigation. She showed the evidence of the stolen funds, the fake contracts, and the systematic bullying of residents. The room was silent as she spoke. Even the people who had once supported Arthur looked ashamed. Then, Sarah invited the victims to speak. One by one, neighbors stood up and told their stories. An older woman named Mrs. Gable spoke about how Arthur had threatened to lien her house over a bird feeder until she gave him her late husband's vintage watch. A young couple talked about how the stress of the fines had nearly ruined their marriage. It was a powerful and emotional night. The community was finally healing by speaking the truth. After the testimonies, a vote was held. It was unanimous. The entire old board was removed from power. A new, interim committee was formed, made up of respected residents who actually cared about the neighborhood. Sarah was asked to be the advisor for the new board to ensure everything was done by the book. As we walked out of the gymnasium that night, the air felt different. It was cool and fresh. Neighbors who had ignored us for months came up to shake our hands and thank us. It was a complete reversal of the day the police stood on our porch. We went home and sat on our front porch, looking at our eggshell white door. It was still the same color, but it didn't represent a violation anymore. It represented a home that we had fought for and won. A few weeks later, the court proceedings against Arthur began. He pleaded guilty to most of the charges in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence, but he still received 10 years in state prison. He was also ordered to pay back every cent he had stolen from the community. The HOA was eventually able to recover most of the funds, which were used to lower the monthly dues and finally fix the community pool that had been broken for years. Life in Meadow Creek returned to a new kind of normal. Sarah continued her work as sheriff, but she was now known as the hero of the neighborhood. People would wave as she drove her SUV past their houses, and they always felt a little safer knowing she was there. I eventually repainted the door, not because of a notice, but because we wanted a fresh start. We chose a bright, welcoming blue. One afternoon, I saw a new family moving in across the street. They looked nervous as they unloaded their boxes. I walked over with a plate of cookies and introduced myself. I told them that this was a good place to live and that the neighbors looked out for one another. I told them they didn't have to worry about the rules as long as they were kind to people. As I walked back to my house, I saw Sarah standing in the doorway, smiling at me. We had been through a nightmare, but we had come out stronger on the other side. We had proven that no matter how much power someone thinks they have, they are never above the law. And more importantly, we had proven that a community is only as strong as the people who are willing to stand up for what is right. The Battle of Meadow Creek was over, and justice had not only been served, but it had found a permanent home. We finally had the quiet life we dreamed of, and this time, it was built on a foundation of truth and respect.